Welcome back to the Stronger by Science podcast. I'm Greg Knuckles.
I'm Andrew Skorakakis.
And I'm Milo Wolf.
And we have another great episode for you guys today. And in this episode, we're talking about sleep. We've discussed sleep several times on the podcast previously. This is definitely not our first episode on the topic. But it still remains one of our most requested topics whenever we ask the community, hey, what would you like to hear us talk about more on the podcast? Sleep is consistently one of the top things that the people are clamoring for, and we are here to meet your needs and desires. So we're diving back into the topic. We're talking about sleep again to provide up-to-date information about how sleep affects health, athletic performance, body composition outcomes, and more. The first part of this episode will provide a bit of a lay of the land, discussing how sleep duration, quality, and consistency affect those various outcomes, while the second part will discuss what you can actually do about it if sleep is something you struggle with. I think a lot of sleep content comes across as delivering information. Sure, it's not much of a surprise to people if you don't sleep much or if you have poor quality sleep. That is generally predictive of negative outcomes, but that's usually where it ends. People might say, try to keep a consistent bedtime and make your room dark. And if that doesn't work, well, you know what? We just told you all of these bad things that will happen, and I guess you just have to take that one on the chin. So we do want to talk a little bit about, some things that might be helpful if you have poor quality sleep, even if you can't necessarily improve your sleep quality all that much. Not all is lost. So we're going to talk about that some at the end. But before we dive in, Pac, Milo, would you guys consider yourselves good sleepers?
So I'll start here. I would consider myself a solid sleeper, but with a lot of terms and conditions. Those mainly being that I am somebody who has always gone to bed later than usual. And when I was at school, obviously that wasn't really the best sort of deal for me personally, because I always found myself sleeping late, which meant I wasn't able to get enough sleep, which also meant that sleep regularity was impacted, because then during the week I would wake up at different times, maybe go to bed a bit earlier. Then on the weekend I would catch up on lost sleep. But since I went to university, so since I was 19 or so, I've made a conscious effort to sleep as good as I can and keep my bedtime regular. And I have been blessed with the ability to be able to sleep late and wake up late consistently. So, which is my favorite and biggest flex. So overall, good sleeper, sure. Weird sleeper, yes. Not your typical, it's 11 p.m., 12 a.m., I'll go to bed and I am asleep. Plus, I am never able to sleep in public or like on airplanes and stuff. I think I've semi-fallen asleep for like the odd 20-minute nap here and there, the 2 times where I hadn't slept and was on a long flight. But other than that, I'm not one of those lucky people that I despise that can just sit down and sleep. Honestly, man, like we've been flying back and forth to the US in the past couple of months lately. And the one thing I see every time, and it grinds my gears, is it's a 2 p.m. flight. People sit on the plane takes off. All of a sudden, everybody's dead asleep. And I'm like, guys, it's not even bedtime. How are you able to do this? I am so jealous.
I mean, I'll tell you how they're able to do it. And that is that this isn't a real statistic. I'll admit I'm fully pulling this number out of my ass right now. But I think like 40% of people just take Ambien before they fly. Either people that just don't like the experience of flying or people that have, apprehensions about air travel and whatnot. A lot of people either just pop an Ambien or pop a Xanax before they get on the plane and just kind of, the Xanax to take the edge off or the Ambien to take them out. Like that's pretty common. Like if you're in the boarding area and you're just kind of like looking around right when they start calling for boarding, you'll see a lot of people just grab a little pill out of their pocket or out of their bag and just like, quickly and furtively pop it in, take a little swig. There's there's a lot of that. I don't think that many people are like raw dogging sleep on flight like super well, that like no chemical assistance, get on the plane, immediately sleep. I'm sure some people do, but yeah, there's a lot of people self-medicating to achieve that level of airplane sleeping.
I mean, I certainly wish I had some Ambien to echo Pax said about sleeping in public. On the way back from our most recent trip to the US, which actually happened the night before the most recent podcast episode, which might explain why we sounded a bit tired. I took both melatonin and NyQuil, I think, ZQL, on the plane, and it was nighttime, it was my bedtime. I took it, felt essentially nothing, and was still unable to fall asleep with a pillow, with a sleeping mask, and with earplugs. So, certainly in the same vein as Pac as far as sleep stuff goes. I would say nowadays I am a good sleeper, maybe even above average, but it wasn't always that way. So when I was a bit younger, from about age 16 to 20 perhaps, I dealt with chronic insomnia, where I would often go to sleep around 10 p.m. and attempt to sleep, and typically fall asleep somewhere between 3 and 6 a.m. So essentially spend like 5 to 8 hours in bed failing to fall asleep, and then eventually fall asleep, wake up maybe at around noon or later if I had the opportunity to wake up that late, or earlier if I had to. And that kind of just kept going on and on and on until eventually it got better. I would say throughout that time, I implemented a lot of the things that people often get recommended for sleep, like, hey, keep your bedroom dark and cold, use a sleep mask or minimize light, earplugs, exercise, sunlight exposure, etc., etc., etc. And I think that those things gradually helped. It wasn't like I'm doing these things and now my sleep is back to normal. But I do tend to think that those things probably helped. So yeah, I would describe myself as a above average sleeper. Like nowadays, I consistently get 8-9 hours of sleep a night in. Still can't sleep in public for anything, unless I'm extremely sleep deprived. Mm-hmm. But I've definitely improved on that front. What about you, Greg?
I'm a horrible sleeper in most regards. Really inconsistent sleep schedule. I also, like you, Milo, had some insomnia issues when I was younger that are mostly in the rear view, but if I try to go to bed before I'm like good and truly tired, they'll rear their head again. And if I can fall asleep in the first like 30 minutes, I'm asleep. And if I'm still awake 30 minutes after I get in bed, it's going to be a long night. That's less common than it used to be. The good thing I will say about my sleep is when I fall asleep, I'm done. Like I am out like a light and impossible to wake up. Much to Lindsay's chagrin sometimes. But yeah, I am an unbelievably deep sleeper once that train leaves the station. I have in fact slept through a hurricane before. My wife and I, we were taking an anniversary trip down to the coast here in North Carolina. And for people that aren't aware of kind of the dynamics of Atlantic hurricane season, North Carolina and Florida are the two places in the U.S. that get the most hurricanes. Florida, because it's, sticking down in there into the Gulf of Mexico, and North Carolina because it kind of like juts out the furthest to the east on the eastern seaboard of the US. Like we have our barrier islands kind of jutting out in there. And so things that turn north and like don't hit Florida, oftentimes they make landfall in North Carolina. Anyway, we had an anniversary trip planned earlier in the year. Our anniversary is not during like normal hurricane season, and I totaled our car while we were trying to go there. So that didn't happen, and so then we rescheduled for a time in October, which is during hurricane season, and we're like, what are the odds that weekend will be a weekend the North Carolina coast gets hit by a hurricane? And as it started getting closer and, the storm season started percolating, we realized, oh no, the North Carolina coast, there's a better than 50% chance it's going to get hit by a hurricane that weekend. But since we'd already had to reschedule and our anniversary's in July, like we didn't want to, it would be weird we didn't want to cancel it all together, and it would be weird to take like a July anniversary trip in like fucking January or something. So we're like, let's send it, let's see what happens. And yeah, so we went, and it was supposed to make landfall a little bit further south, and where we were going to be staying wasn't supposed to get the worst of it. But overnight, the path of the storm turned north, and it went like literally like the eye of the storm passed over where we were. And it wasn't like a category 5 or anything, but I think it was like a weak category 4, which is a pretty significant hurricane. And when I woke up, we were kind of on we were more than midway through like the back half of the storm wall. And it wasn't that it woke me up. Like I just woke up after 9-10 hours. Like I got a full night of sleep, and I was like, damn, it sounds like someone's running a weed eater outside of the window. What's going on here? And I look out the window, and we just looked like we were in the pits of hell. Like the wind was just making everything go absolutely ape shit outside. I think when I woke up, it was still like sustained like 90 mile an hour winds, like 80, 90 mile an hour winds. Like it was still whipping. And that ended up being really fun because I had never been in a hurricane before. And like the dangerous part is the storm surge. So like when you're on the back half of the storm wall, nothing like truly dangerous is happening anymore typically. Don't take that as like public health advice. I'm sure something dangerous could still happen. But for the most part, what you need to be worried about then is kind of like downed power lines and water, or like dirty water sources, or like bacterial exposure and whatnot. But like, you're probably not going to like acutely drown, or like the most acute danger is behind you. So I was like, this is my first time in a hurricane. I need to go out and experience this. And so one, if you've never walked through like sustained 70 plus mile an hour winds, it's very fun. Like it's more challenging than you would think. And it was painful because it's the beach, there's sand, like walked outside. I felt like I was getting sand blasted. But just like balancing yourself and steadying yourself to walk through winds that speed, surprisingly challenging, surprisingly fun. Really enjoyed it. Second, there was an outdoor hot tub at the place we were staying. And so like after just kind of going down on the beach, checking out the waves and whatnot, we went to the hot tub, and like it was one of the most serene and surreal things that I've ever experienced, because it looks like the world is falling down around you, and you're just in this warm, cozy water watching it as an observer that feels like insulated from everything. Anyway, all of which is to say, hurricane's very loud, and I slept through it. So in that regard, I am a good sleeper.
Was that without earplugs?
Yeah, I don't wear earplugs. I'm like the princess and the pea when it comes to my sleeping arrangements. Like if I'm too hot, I can't sleep. And if there's anything touching my face, I can't sleep. Like I can't do face mask, can't do earplugs. All of that just completely anathema to me. I like when I'm out, I just don't hear anything. I'm done.
I've got a story that might make you very uncomfortable then. Back when my insomnia was at its peak, earplugs didn't cut it, the minus 20 decibel, whatever they provide. So I'd actually sleep with headphones, just like the ones we have on right now, on, blasting white noise on maximum sound on repeat. I had downloaded an MP3 file from YouTube that was white noise 10 hours extended, and I was blasting that bad boy, and I couldn't hear a thing anymore. Was it uncomfortable? Yeah. Did it mean that university student hall accommodation like residential halls, whatever you call them, were all of a sudden much more manageable. Hell yeah. So
Nice.
different strokes.
That's awesome. Yeah, dude, like I got in trouble in college a lot for how deeply I slept, because when the dorms would have like fire drills during the night, I would just sleep through them. And the RAs would think that I was trying to be like rebellious or whatever, because they'd do a head count and they'd see someone was missing. They'd go back in. They'd be like, who burned to death inside the hall? Like, who made us fail his fire drill? And it was me every time. And I sincerely and truly just did not ever hear the fire alarm. Like if I'm in a building that catches on fire, I'm toast. Like literally,
burns are worth it. Trust me.
I am literally
crazy.
cooked if that ever happens. Milo or Pack, one of you mentioned that here in this kind of like intro banter, you also wanted to swap sleep stories a little bit. Have we done that, or were there other was there another anecdote someone wanted to share?
Based on what you said, there was one from a school excursion where I was also the last one to wake up, where I hadn't woken up, and the teacher came in, and I was feeling a bit not ashamed, but I was like, okay, I know that I should have been up, and I had woken up by the time the teacher had come to look for me, and I was like, okay, we gotta now make it seem as if we're dead asleep, and that's why we're not up. So he was in my ear screaming, and screaming some bad stuff as well. But I was like, okay, we are asleep now. We're gonna commit to this. Pretend you're asleep. But that said, big earplug enjoyer, big sleep mask enjoyer, to the point where I have 3 backup masks, one at home, one in my laptop bag, and multiple earplugs in various places and bags, plus sleep tracker enjoyer, mostly for the placebo effect, because I look at the time in bed and the time asleep, but I've been tracking sleep for the past 70 years or so. So it's good to look at the app and say, okay, 8 hours in bed average. Woo, we are healthy.
Nice. Hell yeah. All right. We're
ready to rock, I think. I could share a lot of anecdotes about sleep, but they're not very interesting. Hey, I slept.
I feel yeah. I probably overshared. Whatever. The people that say that they miss banter heavy episodes, you guys are eating well today, and the people that complain about banter heavy episodes, we have timestamps for a reason. You could have skipped ahead to the start of the content, and you're listening to this by choice. Anyway, let's do some plugs and get into the content for this episode. So, if you enjoy the podcast, please like, rate, subscribe, tell your friends. It really helps us out. If you're interested in hiring an online coach to help you with your training and/or nutrition, Stronger by Science has an excellent team of coaches that can help you out. You can learn more at strongerbyscience.com/coaching. If you are a supplement enjoyer and you want some stuff that is high quality and a good price, and you want to make it an even better price, head over to bulksupplements.com and use code SBSPOD at checkout for a 5% discount. If you want to stay up to date on all of the goings on in the Stronger by Science universe, check out our Facebook group and subreddit. It's Stronger by Science community on Facebook, and reddit.com/r/Stronger by Science. I think the subreddit recently hit 20,000 subscribers. That's a very cool milestone. And everyone who subscribes to the subreddit, we love and appreciate all of you. And if you want to stay further in touch with us, you can check out our newsletter, where we send you high quality, informative content almost exclusively. Very little sales material. We're not just spamming you with a bunch of ads. So if you would like high quality, nerdy, scientific lifting information sent right to your inbox, you can check that out at strongerbyscience.com/newsletter. And finally, if you have questions that you would like us to address on the podcast at some point, record a voice clip, a minute or less, and email it to podcast@strongerbyscience.com. And if we like it, we will answer your question on the show.
Let me add a last plug here, just because we are bringing back the YouTube channel. If you're not subscribed,
yes.
yes, Stronger by Science on YouTube. That would be youtube.com/@strongerbyscience. We are nearly at 60,000 subscribers. We will take credit for 50 of those. By we, I mean Milo and myself. But the channel is making a comeback with long and short form videos, full of science, full of citations, and the odd joke here and there. So if you're a fan of the podcast and you want to see slightly less lengthy material, but still, lengthy enough, make sure you subscribe. Plenty of stuff coming. On that note, sleep, as we all know, is critical for overall health. This is going to be some record-breaking science that you're about to hear in the next few sentences, but it is very important for cognitive function, mood, mental health, and of course various physical health aspects, including cardiovascular and metabolic health for children, adolescents, and adults. Now, adequate sleep is responsible for reducing the risk of accidents, injuries, while the opposite, sleep deprivation and sleep disorders, can have a significant negative effect on health and obviously safety. Sleep is a multifaceted thing, but it is not as simple as straightforward as how many hours you sleep. It's obviously that's one of the aspects that encompasses sleep, but timing, regularity, disorders, quality, all those play a significant role in how sleep impacts your health, recovery, and so on and so forth. And the usual recommendations that we see being floated around are that adults get at least 7 hours of sleep per night. However, survey data and just data looking at sleep patterns and sleep habits in adults and sometimes in children show that several people do not meet those requirements, and that's why sleep is such a requested topic, not only on the Stronger by Science podcast, but in general. Sleep supplements, sleep guides, sleep interventions gain quite a bit of attraction. So the way we've approached this is we are going to be looking at each of those different factors that impact sleep, what the current literature says about those factors, break down some of the common limitations observed, because things are not as straightforward, and then we will be talking about practical applications and how, and as Greg mentioned, things that you can do to mitigate for poor sleep. So starting with one of the most recent meta-analyses on sleep duration specifically, which is the most common factor that we hear talked about in sleep. How long do you sleep? Did you spend enough time in bed? And so on and so forth, is a meta-analysis by Tong Zhu et al. From 2017 titled Sleep Duration and Risk of All-Cause Mortality, a Flexible Nonlinear Meta-Regression of 40 prospective cohort studies. Now, this meta focused specifically on cohort studies examining the relationship between sleep duration and all-cause mortality in adult populations with a minimum follow-up of 2 years. And the author specifically required studies to categorize sleep duration into 3 or more levels so that they could that would fit in their nonlinear meta-regression model. In total, the authors included 40 cohort studies that encompassed over 2 million participants, actually, and over 200,000 deaths. And the majority of the studies that were included, and we're going to touch on that being one of the potential limitations, used self-reported sleep data with a mean follow-up duration of around 12 years. And the studies spanned diverse geographic locations and averaged a mean entry age of approximately 62 years. Now, when looking specifically at the results of this meta, we'll first look at 24-hour sleep duration findings, where the authors found a J-shaped relationship with all-cause mortality, where increased risks existed for both short, so less than 7 hours per night, and long, so over 8 hours per night sleep durations. More specifically, durations of 4, 5, and 6 hours were associated with an incrementally increased risk as far as all-cause mortality goes, and so were durations of 9, 10, and 11 hours. The authors also looked at night sleep duration, and they also found a J-shaped curve, but only long durations, so over 8 hours, were significantly associated with increased mortality, but short night sleep durations did not show a significant risk compared to the 7-hour reference. Now, the authors additionally, and we're going to be moving on to touching on some of the limitations of the study and what we think of these findings. They also performed a plethora of subgroup analysis, which indicated that the increased risk associated with long sleep durations over 8 hours persisted across different age groups, sexes, and health statuses. And more specifically, long sleep durations imposed a higher risk in both sexes and were particularly noted in unhealthy individuals for, again, durations beyond 7 hours. So overall, the authors concluded that sleeping 7 to 8 hours daily is recommended for optimal health outcomes, and that future research should focus on improving methods for recording sleep duration to minimize measurement bias and also consider sleep quality as a potential co-founding factor, something that we will touch on later in this episode, and specifically looking at studies that have taken, in my opinion at least, a better way, a better approach at looking at sleep duration. So I'll pose the question, what do you gentlemen think about the results of this meta-analysis?
Sure, I'll go first. Broadly speaking, I was surprised to find, well, simultaneously surprised and not so surprised to find that the optimal health outcomes were generally seen at 7 to 8 hours of daily sleep. On the one hand, as a lifter, I always thought that more sleep would be beneficial for sort of overall health and performance, and so my general heuristic has always been, if I can get more sleep in, why not? So on the one hand, when I first saw these results, a small part of me was like, wait a minute, have I been oversleeping? Or am I 9 hours a night overkill and or, bad for my health? In thinking about it a bit more closely, I think there's a few considerations that need to be re-emphasized. One, the average age of participants, or rather just the people being analyzed within the study, was, I think, around 62 years old. And if you look at the spread of the age of the participants, the vast majority were over about 50 years old, if I recall correctly. And so we're talking about a relatively older skewing cohort of participants being analyzed here. And generally, you do see that with older people, their average sleep duration decreases. Just relatively naturally, they tend to sleep for shorter durations each night than younger people. And so, in this case, I wouldn't be surprised if at least some of the relationship being seen with higher sleep durations being associated with higher risks of all-cause mortality, cardiovascular disease, and so forth, or specifically in this case, all-cause mortality, could just have to do with the average age of the cohort. With that being said, I think that the increased risk associated with long sleep durations did still appear to be there across different age groups. But I think that generally the risk may be attenuated if you're somewhat younger and generally just benefit from longer sleep durations. So that was one thing. In general, it was just interesting to see that, if anything, the worse health outcomes were more meaningful when you overslept versus underslept in these specific findings. Just as a sort of general bias going into this body of research, I would have expected the opposite. So yeah, just a few interesting things that kind of struck me as someone who wasn't super familiar with the health research around sleep.
Excuse me, Greg. I just wanted to...
You're excused.
Thank you. I wanted to touch on something that I do think is a severe limitation, in my opinion, given that in the meta by Tong Zhu et al., obviously the primary method that was identified as collecting data on sleep duration was self-reporting through questionnaires where people were asked about their average sleep duration every night. And I do feel that if we were to, and again, this is my opinion, terms and conditions apply, and just a hunch that I have that if we were to take the sleep duration reported and actually break it down in actual time slept, that would be slightly different. So when when somebody's asked how long do you sleep, I tend to assume that people usually just think, okay, what time did I go to bed? When did I wake up? So and then they do that. They do that in their head, that calculation in their head, and then they estimate how much they've slept. But in reality, and as you both alluded to your own personal anecdotes, just being in bed doesn't necessarily mean that you are fast asleep. So I do feel that we need to be slightly cautious with how we interpret those specific values as far as 7 to 8 hours as sleep.
Yeah, no, I feel you there. The couple of things that I wanted to pull out from this is one, just to kind of just to reiterate what Milo was saying and to put a bit of a finer point on it. The findings related to longer sleep durations and higher all-cause mortality rates, it is like that to me, is one of the things that I come back to as a likely example of reverse causation, where these are observational studies. You're observing how much are people sleeping per night, and you're looking to see if that is associated with a particular outcome, in this case, all-cause mortality. And that doesn't necessarily allow you to infer or imply causation. And in this case, it is possible that sleeping a long time causally makes you die faster. But I think that that's very unlikely. I think, like Milo mentioned, older adults just tend to gradually sleep less as they age. Your pineal gland starts getting sleepy, doesn't pump out as much melatonin, and so sleep duration, sleep depth, sleep quality, all of those things just tend to decline with age. And so the people who are sleeping 9, 10, 11 hours per night in their 60s or 70s are usually people with who already have really serious chronic health conditions that cause extreme fatigue to make them sleep that much. Whereas if you're a 20, 30 something year old athlete and you're training really hard and you just naturally sleep 9 hours a night, that doesn't mean that is bad for you, because your normal sleep is different from someone in their 60s. And the things that might be contributing to you being extra sleepy are you're training hard. That makes you tireder. That makes you want to sleep more, versus you have some sort of chronic health condition that makes you tired and makes you want to sleep more. One of those things, training hard, tends to build up your capacity, make you more robust, make you healthier. The other one, dealing with a chronic health condition, does tend to mean that you're kind of on a downward slope. So, sleeping longer than normal could be caused by different things, and those different causes probably would lead to different causal relationships between sleep duration and health outcomes. So, yeah, I that's one of those things where when this is presented, it's actually really bad to sleep a long time, I never hear it presented in context of older adults observational research. I almost always hear it presented as if it's a causal relationship that applies across all age groups, and I'm just so skeptical of that. So that was one of the things I wanted to pull out. Another is that if for this meta-analysis, and also just a lot of the research we're going to talk about here, a lot of folks who mostly pay attention to exercise research might hear some of the methodology of these studies and think, oh, well, that's very weak. That sounds like bad research. We're not going to see a bunch of interventions. We're not going to see a bunch of RCTs. we will, in some cases, like there are intervention studies and randomized control trials looking at like sleep interventions in athletes, for instance, that we'll talk about later in the episode. But a lot of these things looking at health outcomes, it is observational and a lot of it is self-reported. And there's a good reason for that. And that is that sleep is like a really important and intimate part of the human experience. And also, acute effects of sleep show up quickly. Like if you're interested in, hey, how much sharper or duller are you when you sleep 8 hours per night versus 4 hours per night? You can run an intervention on that because guess what? When you sleep 3 hours, you're not as mentally sharp as you are when you sleep 8 hours. Like I think everyone knows that. So you can manipulate subjects' sleep for like 1 night, 2 nights, up to a week, sometimes up to 2 or 3 weeks. You can't manipulate people's sleep for years, which is what you would need to meaningfully influence some of these like chronic health outcomes. And so, yeah, like we're never going to have high quality RCTs on like what is the effect of like, experimentally making some people sleep more, sleep less for 5-10 years or whatever. Like no one is going to sign up for the short sleep group. Since this is the Stronger by Science podcast, like one of the questions that comes up a lot is like, hey, well, how does, and dovetails with what I'm saying now, a question that comes up a lot is like, hey, how does sleep duration, sleep quality affect my gains in the gym? And anyone who confidently answers that question to you is lying or is completely unaware of the lack of evidence in this regard. You can give your suspicions, you can share opinions, but there is no research on that because you would need studies that will never exist. Like a training intervention that's 12 weeks long, if you sign up and, the randomization is one group is going to be doing ad libitum sleep and the other group, we're restricting their sleep to 4 hours per night. Guess what? If you get randomized into the 4 hours per night group, you're going to drop out. You're not going to finish the study. Like that's just not a feasible study to do. And so, yeah, there's no like high quality RCTs, like intervention studies, longitudinal on a lot of the outcomes that would potentially interest people. So yeah, anyone who's like very confidently saying, hey, sleeping less affects your gains by this much, they're making shit up, pulling numbers out of their ass.
Yeah, I completely agree with that specific point. I know I mentioned earlier about the relationship still being there with younger and older participants, and you mentioned that potentially overall the relationship between super high sleep durations, increasing risk of all-cause mortality, being more so reverse causation caused by the generally older age within the sample of about 65 years old on average. Specifically, when I mentioned that the relationship maintained whether we're looking at the older subgroup or the younger subgroup, in this case, all that meant was the younger subgroup was below 65 years old and the older one above 65. So even in the quote-unquote younger group here in this analysis, we're talking about still pretty old people. So overall, even though the relationship was still there that, yeah, longer sleep durations were associated with higher all-cause mortality, even in the younger subgroup wasn't that young. It was just below 65, and I think on average might still be around 50 or 60. So just kind of reinforcing the argument that this might be more so reverse causation than anything like long sleep is killing you, ?
Yeah, for sure. And the last thing that I wanted to pull out from this is, like I mentioned up top, I do think that there's, I don't know. I think that there is a fair bit of like alarmism related to sleep stuff, where, I'm definitely not going to make the controversial and untrue opinion that not sleeping much is actually totally fine, actually, and there are no drawbacks. But I do think that, I don't know. I think that there's a bit of pretty unjustifiable alarmism about it, where, yeah, if you don't sleep much or your sleep quality is poor, that's that's not great. Like I and probably no one else is going to argue that it is, but I do think that in terms of especially like mortality outcomes, a lot of the risks are blown out of proportion. Like in this case, sleeping less than 7 hours per night was the risk, or the relative risk for all cause mortality was like 1.05. That's like a 5% increase in risk, which is not nothing, but that, you know, that those are relative figures, and the way that that's reported is like likelihood of dying in a particular year or whatever. So, you know, if you're 60, like I don't know the fucking actuarial tables by heart or anything, but let's say it's 60 years old, you have a 2% chance of dying in a given year or something like that. That would mean that if you had a 2% chance of dying if you slept 7 hours per night, if you're sleeping 4 or 5 hours per night, you have a, oh man, math in my head on the show, a 2.1%. Yeah.
2.1.
So yeah, you're dealing with a difference in absolute risk of like 2 versus 2.1%. That's what the relative risk of 1.05 means. And so yeah, that's moving in the wrong direction. You would like it to be below 2 instead of above, but we're not talking about just dramatic change in risk. And there are some sleep related variables that are somewhat more predictive of deleterious health outcomes. But yeah, I mean, you know, I'm willing to say it's bad to sleep 4 or 5 hours per night, but the degree to which it is bad and deleterious, I do think is often severely blown out of proportion. Like it's not ideal, but literally speaking, it probably won't kill you. Like you're a little worse off, but you're not that bad off. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I mean, specifically for the people that are listening to this podcast that are, you know, I'm making an assumption, but are likely, you know, physically active, engaging in some form of resistance training, and potentially also look at their diet. The idea that, oh, you know, you're in your last year of university and all of a sudden your average sleep duration is down to 5 to 6 hours per night. If you were to look at some of the mainstream reporting on sleep, you could seriously nocebo yourself that, oh, this is it. I'm, you know, cutting a decade off my life just because I had this 1 year where I slept less. But as we will see now, moving on to the next study, there are other variables as well that may even be stronger predictors of mortality risk than just sleep duration on its own. Which brings us to this amazing, and this is me just being biased because I liked the results of the study. This great piece of literature that I also used on the plane when a lady told me, "Hey, that's not healthy." When I told her I sleep late and I wake up late, and then she proceeded to sleep for 1.5 hours on the plane and then say, "I'm gonna go day drink in the UK." So I digress, though. So this one is called "Sleep Irregularity is a Stronger Predictor of Mortality Risk Than Sleep Duration: A Prospective Cohort Study" by Windred et al. 2023. So, there's been some emerging evidence suggesting that sleep regularity, or in other words, the day-to-day consistency of sleep to wake timing, may be a stronger health outcome predictor than just looking at average sleep duration. Because irregular sleep patterns, and we'll briefly touch on like night shift work as well, briefly looking at a couple of studies, but like irregular sleep patterns have traditionally been associated with negative health outcomes, including adverse cardiometabolic outcomes, epigenetic aging, depressed mood, and lower quality of life overall. So essentially, this study tried to assess whether sleep regularity is indeed a strong predictor for all-cause mortality. Now, it's important to note that this study recruited about 500,000 participants aged 40 to 69 between 2006 and 2010, and they did that as part of the UK Biobank, which the UK Biobank is essentially a large long-term biobank study in the United Kingdom, which looks at a bunch of different stuff. That was very insightful there. And they essentially, from this cohort, approximately 100,000 participants wore accelerometer devices for 7 days between 2013 and 2016 to capture sleep behavior. And they did that in free living conditions. So they wore those accelerometers on their dominant wrist, and participants obviously consented to wearing them. Now, this is where things could get pretty geeky. I'm not super confident to talk about the sleep regularity index in detail. I'm not sure if you guys are, but it gets pretty deep. So the authors use the sleep regularity index, essentially a metric that measures day-to-day similarity in sleep patterns, and also considers sleep-wake states across 24-hour epochs. It accounts for irregularities during fragmented sleep, napping, and variable sleep onset and offset times. And in order to obtain valid sleep regularity index scores, one is required to spend at least 120 hours of data collecting, excluding non-wear time and miscalculated days. Now, the authors specifically, if I'm not mistaken, they used an R package that was developed by the authors themselves, or at least modified by the authors themselves. So they used an R package called SleepReg for calculating SRI scores. And if you look at the supplemental materials of the paper, it gets pretty heavy, because when I saw the actual values that they obtained, I then tried to compare with my sleep tracking app, and I was like, wait a second, that doesn't make sense. And then I looked at their code and I was like, oh, okay, this is very complicated. I am not going to look at it. I will just look at my 90% sleep regularity and tell myself I'm doing a good job. But essentially, they calculated average sleep duration across the study using the sleep regularity index scoring as well. And they included a plethora of covariates, like base physical activity levels, again derived from accelerometer data, demographic information, health status, other conditions like cancer, diabetes, and so on and so forth. And in the end, they analyzed data from over 60,000 participants that had to have valid sleep regularity index scores, with a mean follow-up of about 6 years. And essentially, they found, when looking at sleep regularity and mortality, higher sleep regularity was significantly associated with a lower all-cause mortality risk, and sleep duration and mortality was presented again in a U-shaped relationship, with all-cause mortality essentially being associated positively with longer sleep durations, and longer sleep durations up to 8 hours were associated with lower mortality risks. Now, interestingly, the authors looked at the comparison of predictive power between regularity and sleep duration, and sleep regularity was a stronger predictor of all-cause mortality than sleep duration, and that occurred even when sleep duration was considered alongside sleep regularity, with the latter still remaining a significant mortality risk predictor. And it even maintained its significance as mortality predictor, even when adjusting for sleep timing and health conditions like cancer, diabetes, and various mental health concerns. So essentially, the findings of the study somewhat challenge the focus on sleep duration in public health frameworks, and in general recommendations, we often just hear the number 7 to 9 hours per night. And the authors essentially encourage consistent sleep patterns, as that may be a more achievable and effective public health goal than solely looking at extending sleep duration. Gentlemen, any comments?
Yeah. I think that there is, I don't know. Like, I don't want to overinterpret this, because once again, this is observational research. It's not quite as much. Yeah, like, we can't use it to confidently draw causal inferences. But this to me does just strike me as extremely plausible, I guess. Like, One thing you find when you dig into the sleep research is that like people like what normal sleep is does vary quite a bit between people. Like we're told that 7 to 8 hours per night or 6 to 8 hours per night is normal, but there are people who just kind of generally need more sleep than that, and there are people that just generally need a little less sleep than that. And I think I don't know. I think a decent general heuristic is that like if you're keeping pretty consistent sleep wake times and you wake up and you feel generally pretty okay and refreshed, you're probably fine. Whether that's you're waking up after 9 hours or waking up after 5 hours, like as long as that is the case, you're probably doing pretty okay. And so I think that people having very regular sleep schedules is generally indicative of them finding sleep schedules that work pretty well for them. Because, yeah, like why would you be going to bed the same time every night and waking up the same time every morning if it sucked for you? Like I'm sure that there are some instances where that's like outside your control, but in general, I think that is a decent indicator that someone has found a sleep schedule that does do for them what they want to in terms of being able to go to sleep and wake up refreshed and recharged. And I think that is good sleep, regardless of how long it is. So that does strike me as plausible. I will say the one confounder that comes to mind a little bit for me is, and I think that this is in the outline and we'll talk about it a little bit later, is like just the like shift work, like how shift work plays into this, where some people have poor sleep regularity kind of by choice. Like they just don't get in bed the same time every night, and that's a decision they make. And some people, might have poor sleep regularity due to some sort of sleep disorder or condition. But then a lot of people have low sleep regularity because they have jobs that dictate low sleep regularity. Like you're working night shifts sometimes, you're working day shifts other times, and that's like dictated by your job. And oftentimes, shift work jobs are more stressful jobs, like a lot of them are either like lower wage labor or higher wage jobs tend to be particularly stressful ones, like doctors, nurses, fire department. And so I do wonder if some of the relationship is perhaps modified by the types of careers that lead to shift work and therefore necessarily lead to poor sleep regularity. So that is just like a potential confounder that I would pull out and put a pin in. But overall, it does feel true to me that sleep regularity probably does matter more than total sleep duration. But yeah, those are my general thoughts, I guess.
Yeah, no, I fully agree with that. And I think that, as you mentioned, we'll touch on sleep regularity in shift workers specifically a little bit later in the episode. For me, there were kind of two things that jumped out. One was if you look at the relationship between sleep regularity index and all-cause mortality and sleep duration and all-cause mortality. The way the authors analyzed the data was via quintiles, so essentially looking at the bottom 20% compared to the bottom 20% of people in terms of sleep regularity to the 20th to 40th percentile of people in terms of sleep regularity, and so forth until 100%. Essentially, 520 percentile quintiles of sleep regularity and sleep duration, respectively. So you're comparing some of the people with the highest sleep regularity to some of the people with the lowest sleep regularity and anywhere in between. And what you see is that while having some of the worst sleep regularity, so the people in the first to 20th percentile in terms of sleep regularity being poor, did have substantially higher risk of all-cause mortality, even just bringing that up into the 20th to 40th percentile, so increasing it somewhat, did substantially alleviate that risk. So it may be a case of diminishing returns where you potentially, assuming there's some causality here, you don't need to be perfect with sleep regularity to alleviate the risk to a large extent. That is one potential takeaway from this. And the same kind of seems to apply to sleep duration, where sleeping in the bottom 20 percentiles only between half an hour to 6 hours per night did substantially increase risk of all-cause mortality. Just bringing that up to the next 20th percentiles, between 6 hours and 6.5 hours, already pretty much removed any increased risk of all-cause mortality. So even just going from, relatively poor to just slightly below average sleep regularity, and going from relatively poor to slightly below average sleep duration seemed to alleviate much of the increase in risk that came with poor sleep regularity and sleep duration. Again, not claiming these are clear, strong causal relationships, but you can generally see that the differences are largest when both sleep regularity and sleep duration are quite low. The other thing that struck me was this study, obviously not as large of a sample as the one we talked about just before this one, the meta-analysis in several million people. But although it was a smaller sample, the average age was lower, I think around 50 or 55 years old. So not a huge amount lower, but definitely lower. And simultaneously, the relationship between sleeping for a long time increasing your all-cause mortality risk was also a fair bit smaller. So specifically in this case, the all-cause mortality risk was pretty similar in the percentiles of people sleeping between around 6 all the way to about 13 and a half hours, suggesting that there's not too strong of a relationship between, obviously, that top end of the range would be a lot more rare. Like there's not many participants sleeping for 13 and a half hours. But certainly it seems like once you get past 6 hours of sleep, maybe up until around 9 hours of sleep in a relatively younger demographic, there may not be a huge difference in terms of all-cause mortality risk in contrast with the meta-analysis we just spoke about earlier. So those are kind of the two things I picked up on. Do you broadly agree, Greg?
No, yeah, that's a really good point on both fronts. Both the looking at impact of long sleep duration in a slightly younger cohort, kind of backing up the suspicion that it's just like, yeah, there's a difference between someone who's 40 sleeping 9 hours per night and someone who's 70. Like, yeah, more 40-year-olds still get good sleep. You're still sleeping that much at 70, something's probably wrong. So yeah, that was a good thing to pull out. And I also think that was a really good point about the non-linearity of the effect, where the deleterious effect, or the larger negative association with between mortality outcomes and sleep irregularity being like pretty heavily influenced by the people with the absolute lowest sleep regularity, like them having considerably worse outcomes, and then people with just kind of bad sleep regularity having slightly worse outcomes, but not that big of a difference. I do think that is a good thing to pull out and just kind of put a pin in, because I do think that that's something that we do see play out from time to time in a lot of, I don't know, in a lot of things where there are nonlinear relationships between some like characteristic and an outcome of interest, when things are communicated to the public by like public health bodies and the scientific establishment and whatnot, things are often like dumbed down and like simplified a little bit, which makes sense. Like I'm not faulting anyone for that, because oftentimes most people don't care that much about like the nuances of these topics. And so it helps to just go with a simple message that gets your point across well. In this case, having poor sleep regularity is bad for health and mortality outcomes. You probably don't want to go much further than that, because then when it's just like, and here's the statistical model used to calculate sleep regularity index, and so it really only becomes a problem when you're starting to get down to a sleep regularity index of like 61 or less or whatever. And here's how you calculate it for yourself. So most people don't want to get that far into the weeds, so it makes sense when you're just trying to relay this to a minimally interested public, just to dichotomize it and say, yeah, sleep regularity important. If you have poor sleep regularity, you might die sooner. But I do think that there are a lot of instances where that sort of communication does, I think, sometimes cause unnecessary alarm in people that, maybe do have a slightly elevated risk of something, but they probably don't need to be like that freaked out about it. Like the one that always comes to mind for me is like the risks associated with obesity, because like a lot of times studies will just split things out into either 3 or 4 BMI categories, like underweight, normal weight, overweight, obese, or just normal weight, overweight, obese, because a lot of samples don't have enough underweight people to really bother analyzing. And when you do that, you do tend to see, for a lot of deleterious health outcomes, maybe a slight uptick or like not much of a difference between just the category of normal weight and the category of overweight. And then you see a larger increase going from overweight to obese. And when you just split it out into 3 groups like that, looks kind of scary. But then in meta-analyses and stuff that do like fully nonlinear analyses to see, hey, at what BMI levels do risks really start ticking up? It's usually kind of like 40 plus, where not a ton of people have BMIs that high, but if you're lumping someone with a BMI, I mean, I'm not saying like no one does. I saw that look back, but like of obese people, most people have BMIs between 30 and 40. Like it's a somewhat normally distributed thing, and as BMIs get higher, the tails get thinner. And yeah, like, it's probably worse to have a BMI of 33 than 23. But like, not that much worse, you know what I mean? But when you're grouping someone with a BMI of 31 and someone with a BMI of 51 together as a single category, then it's like, oh, just the category of obesity is associated with like pretty high risks. And yeah, like I think that we're seeing something similar here with sleep regularity, where it's just like, there are a lot of these things where like if you get too big, it's bad for health, but it's pretty nonlinear. Whereas you get bigger, get slight increases in risk, and then past a certain point, you get dramatically faster increases in risk. It's a similar sort of deal here, where if your sleep regularity gets a little worse, slight increase in risk. When it gets really bad, yeah, it does look like a pretty big increase in risk. But if you're somewhere kind of in the normal-ish range, you probably don't need to be that freaked out about it. And when things are just like dichotomized, things on the somewhat deleterious end of the normal range can be made to look way scarier than they actually are.
Yeah.
Yeah. That brings up 2 thoughts for me. One is, I think a lot of it has to do with categorization. So if you're essentially just categorizing people into healthy weight, overweight, and obese, healthy weight and overweight are respectively 5 BMI points wide categories, whereas obesity is essentially theoretically infinite, Yeah. And so it can encompass a much larger and potentially, as a consequence, more deleterious range of consequences, I guess, if you just categorize it into 3 distinct categories. The second thing I was curious about your thoughts on, because I don't think I've ever heard you speak on this, I tend to think that to a large extent, this is also what many of the meta-analyses on VO2 max tend to fall into. Is this a hot take? And are we going too tangential here? But I just wanted to get your quick thoughts on that.
Just tell me what you're thinking with that.
So I tend to think that, especially when looking at quartiles or quintiles, much of the relationship observed between VO2 max and health outcomes tends to be dictated by the lowest quintile or quartile VO2 max having relatively worse health outcomes. And realistically, oftentimes, the VO2 max in the highest quartile or quintile health outcome, The VO2 max isn't even that high typically. It's typically around like 40 to 45 milliliters per kilogram per minute or above.
Oh, yeah.
And so that, it's not that high of a VO2 max to reach. So even the best health outcomes, assuming they happen in the highest quartile, aren't actually had at a super high VO2 max like some people make it out to be. And two, much of the relationship is still dictated by the people in the lowest quintile or quartile experiencing worse health outcomes, not necessarily by, if you want the best health outcomes, you must be an elite runner now. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that there is a lot of that. I will be honest, I am a little bit less. I'm aware of the stuff on VO2 max. It's not something I've looked into quite as much, but that is a similar dynamic to what you see when people look at health and mortality outcomes with like lean mass or muscle mass or appendicular lean tissue mass or strength and mortality and health outcomes, where it's just like, yeah, the highest quartile or the highest quintile, they're not that fucking jacked. They're not that fucking strong. Like people saying like, oh yeah, like I need to maintain a 500-pound squat into my 60s to make sure I don't die. It's like,
yes,
more power to you. There's nothing wrong with that, but if you're trying to be in that top quartile, it's like, yeah, if you can squat 185 in your 60s, like you're probably there. And yeah. And conversely, the people in the lowest quartile or quintiles are often like very unmuscular and very weak. And it's like, yeah,
do you even lift, you know?
Right. And that again gets back to like the correlation causation thing. It's like folks who are that weak, oftentimes in their 60s, are typically also dealing with other like related health outcomes that might cause or be associated with like muscle wasting or whatever. Or, I don't know. I do think that that's very plausible. The other thing I'll say about this, and this is like, now we are going kind of far afield, is I do think with stuff like that in particular, like associations between VO2 max or strength or lean mass and health and mortality outcomes, I think that there is a natural assumption to that, like that training to bring about a particular adaptation or physiological capacity is the same as having that like physiological capacity or characteristic, when that's, I don't necessarily know that we can make that assumption. Like for instance, the assumption is if you have a low VO2 max and you train and your VO2 max comes up, that will therefore mean that your health risks are the same as someone who already had a VO2 max in the top quartile or quintile, even if they didn't have to train for it. Like, you know, essentially once you achieve the same physical characteristics, regardless of whether it was innate or whether you had to train for it, that will necessarily lead to the same outcomes. I don't know that that's like necessarily a great assumption. Like one of the things, I don't know, like I don't want to make it sound like I'm like anti-exercise, because I'm not. I'm extremely pro-exercise. But I do think that sometimes things like that should be like communicated a bit more clearly. Like an unfortunate thing is that, there's not like a ton of like super high quality studies about this. I don't want to make it sound like there is. But the studies that have been done that look at the impact of exercise interventions on mortality outcomes, in already older people, don't tend to have the results that we would hope that they would. In effect, if you take two people and they're 60 years old and one of them is twice as strong as the other, there's a pretty good chance that the one that's twice as strong will live longer. But if you take someone who is already 60 years old and already weak and have them start training and get stronger, they might live a little longer, but it's not the same delta as people who were at those different levels of like physical capacities when they reached that age. So yeah, like, I don't know. Yeah, I think that that's just like an important thing to disambiguate. Like findings that people that have higher VO2 maxes live longer may mean that if you train and improve your VO2 max, you'll live longer. Like I think you probably will. But the amount longer that you live may not be quite as large as just the cross-sectional research based on differences in those physical capacities, not training for those physical capacities would suggest.
Yeah. So, two things. First of all, when this is the Harsh Truths podcast now, and
the other thing I want to say, there are still like tons of benefits of exercise. Like, you know, if you're in bad shape at 60, and you start exercising, it's probably like, my understanding of the research as it exists is that that's probably not going to help you live like 10 years longer. Maybe it helps you live a little bit longer, and like that's still good for something. But it will still like dramatically improve your quality of life and your health span. So, you know, like that is, yeah, like that's an important thing worth noting. But yeah, there is a difference between those two things. Like the research just looking at differences in physical capacities and the research looking at actually training in ways to attain those physical capacities have somewhat different outcomes. At least when it comes to mortality. Again, like you can get stronger, you can move better, feel better, have a longer health span, but the actual training doesn't seem to influence lifespan quite as much as I think people would hope that it would.
Yeah. So, two things. First of all, I'll say you've said to Milo personally on some chat, one of the realest things I have ever heard when it comes to exercising and living longer. And it's this idea. So you've said that, you know, being alive and staying alive, it does not require the level of fitness that some people, you know, assume. And, you know, being somewhat physically active and, you know, doing some lifting is more than enough for your body to be like, okay, I'm well equipped now. I'm more than equipped to be healthy and alive. Because I do feel like a lot of people confuse being physically fit to perform specific tasks that we've associated with health. So like being able to run 5 kilometers without being, you know, absolutely destroyed or doing that in an appropriate time. So that's been one. I wanted to give you your flowers on air and say that's been a really cool way telling people that, hey, you don't need to become a sprinter or a CrossFit athlete in order to be healthy, fit enough to stay alive. Just some physical activity and some lifting will do the trick. But the other thing I wanted to say, when I did the face before for the BMI statement, it was not. It was rather because I have been looking at some of the meta-analytic data on BMI and all-cause mortality, and I was taught to believe that, oh, you know, if you're over 25 BMI, it's over for you, buddy, especially if you don't lift. Like, this is it. Like, you are looking at a huge risk when it comes to your health. Obviously, there is a risk, but if you actually look at the hazard ratios, things are not as extreme as they're often portrayed to be. So, more flowers for you. This is... I hope you're not allergic to all those flowers arriving your way, but yeah.
It turns out I am very allergic to flowers. It is pollen season in North Carolina, and I am struggling, but that's fine. I can take it. But yeah, no, I definitely appreciate that. Yeah, that is something that I think surprises people. Like,
yeah.
That the slopes get really steep after a BMI of 40, and I don't want to make it sound like they don't. But yeah, it's not just like a linear monotonic increase in risk. Like, yeah, like once again, like this shouldn't be a hot take, but like I do think that the research broadly suggests that health outcomes tend to be best with a BMI between like 20 and 30. Like the difference between normal weight and overweight, pretty fucking trivial. And then if you have like a low obese BMI, like that is probably worse. But like, yeah, the difference between like 25 and 35, not that big. The difference between 35 and 45 is very big. Like it's non-linear relationships fuck people up, I think. And categorization makes things confusing.
Back to sleep.
Back to sleep.
Yes. Wake up. We're back to sleep now. So now, just to touch on, like, we talked about sleep regularity, and on the show outline, I've made a brief note of a study on total and call-specific mortality of U.S. nurses working rotating night shifts by Gu et al. From 2015. Now, overall, and I would not consider myself an expert on the literature on night shift work and all-cause mortality, but everything that I have seen as far as meta-analytic data goes, potentially with the exception of a 2012 meta-analysis, in general, things... There seems to be a negative association between working night shifts and all-cause mortality, which is somewhat confirmed by this study, essentially, where the authors found a significant increase in all-cause and cardiovascular disease mortality among women with over 5 years of rotating night shift work compared to those who never worked night shifts. Now, to mention the hazard ratio specifically, we're talking about a hazard ratio of 1.11 for both 6 to 14 years and over 15 years of shift work. And for cardiovascular disease mortality, the hazard ratios were 1.19 for 6 to 14 years and 1.23 for over 15 years of shift work. However, no significant association was found between rotating night shift work and overall cancer mortality, except for lung cancer, for those that were working night shift work for over 15 years. So, again, as you mentioned, some other co-founders as well, the type of job, potentially the stress that comes with working in this sort of environment, things do look worse for people that do tend to have somewhat irregular sleep patterns and work night shifts on 1 week or a few days during the week, and then assuming they're sleeping normal the other days. But again, we're talking about pretty extreme examples. Like that's different to, you and I, Greg, sleeping later than most individuals and waking up later versus, oh, okay, it's Monday. You're going to go to the hospital from 6 p.m. until 6 a.m. and sleep at 9 a.m. or 8 a.m. And then 3 days later, you're going to sleep at another time and so on and so forth. But overall, the data on night shift work seems to somewhat support the sleep regularity. That sleep regularity seems to be somewhat of an important factor in the overall effect of sleep and health.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. This is not directly related to the research itself, but this is something I feel like I just need to get off my chest. In the case of like doctors, nurses, EMTs, firefighters, whatever, having people on call 24 hours a day, like, absolutely makes sense. Like someone could flatline at 3 a.m. and like you want medical professionals there. So certain professions, it makes sense that there's night workers and shift work and whatnot. Like that makes sense. One thing though that does like drive me a little crazy, I guess, is like, there are a lot of jobs where there's like night shift and like overnight work, or even like businesses that close late, but like close for the night, but close at like 4 a.m. So the workers still end up having like really, really messed up sleep schedules. There's like so much of that I think is just like completely unnecessary, and I think speaks to our economic system putting like the pursuit of profit above human health and happiness. Because like, yeah, you need nurses working overnight, but like the widget factory that makes bozos and ding dongs or whatever. Like, do you really need to have those running off the line 24 hours a day? Like, yeah, sure. Like, you can ramp up your production and make more profit, but it's bad for everyone that has to work those night shifts, you know? And there are a lot of people to whom that applies. Like, they're doing like factory work, or they're working in a business that's like open overnight. Like here in the US, I don't think this is as much of a thing in Europe. It might be, I don't know. But like in the US, like 24-hour supermarkets are a big thing. And sometimes that's come in handy for me. Like, as a night owl, there are times where like Walmart's open 24 hours, go to Walmart at 4 a.m., pick something up. Not that upset that it's open. But like, I don't know how they're like turning a profit on those hours, because when I go to the store, then there's no one else there except for a bunch of people, not like a ton of people, but like, you know, people stocking shelves, like working the cash register and whatnot. And like, just close it, you know, like stuff like that, like factory jobs where the factories run 24 hours, whether anyone's like actively thinking about this or not, like a calculus is being made that like the profit derived from having an overnight shift is more valuable to the owners and shareholders of the company than like pretty reliably deleterious health outcomes for all of their hundreds or thousands of workers that are working those shifts. And would the material standards of living in our society be that much lower if some of those jobs didn't have night shifts? I don't really think so. But there is like a pretty significant cost to human health and happiness for the marginal increase in standards of living that come from having a bunch of people work overnight jobs that have no fucking reason to be overnight jobs. Again, stuff like doctors and nurses, like, yeah, they need to work overnight. That just kind of goes with the profession. But like, yeah. The reason one of the reasons I feel so strongly about that is my dad worked third shift in a factory and did that for his entire career. And like when he retired, like his health like dramatically improved pretty fucking quickly, just from like being able to sleep at night every night instead of, you know, sleeping during the day 5 nights a week and then at night on the weekends, and having just that big switch back and forth in sleep schedule. Like as someone who like knows him and loves him and has known him his whole life, like the impact that not doing shift work anymore, again, not as like a doctor or nurse, but like working a factory job, the impact of getting away from that was pretty big. And yeah, I don't know. I'm not crazy about that is all I'm going to say.
That sounds pretty reasonable. I mean, I'm glad that stopping the night shifts helped your dad. And I appreciate the general sentiment, but Greg, I'm going to have to call you out here. The irony of mourning the conditions of work for night shifts. In the meantime, the second episode, or the second part of the Volume podcast, had us working into late hours of midnight. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, Greg, he's been forcing us into night shifts with those 5-hour episodes. I am just glad that we weren't around for the aspartame episode. It would have gone into 2 a.m. and beyond. Our health would have never recovered.
Getting off the clock at midnight is not night shift work. That is second shift. Night shift is either 1 a.m. to 9 a.m. or midnight to 8. So that's fine, and I do not feel bad about that.
The good news is, based on the very study we were discussing, as long as we quit this job within 5 years, we'll be fine. Because if you actually look at the data, the risk only really started increasing once people had been working night shifts for 5 or more years. Before 5 years, the risk of all-cause mortality, cardiovascular disease, and cancer essentially didn't increase at all. All I'm saying is, 2-3 years maybe, and peace, you know?
Look, you were the guys that made the outline for that episode. We start
That's
recording at 5 p.m. your time. If we're churning out 2-hour episodes, you're done at 7. Even if we banter a little bit before and after, you're done at 7:30. Getting done with that at midnight, that was your choice. I was not the one that made that outline. I take no personal responsibility for that.
To be fair, for me, 12 a.m. is what, 6 p.m. So unfortunately, I'm quitting the union.
Like
I'm siding with the CEOs.
I'm gonna go even further. That was 1 hour past my usual bedtime, so my sleep regularity right now plummeting. You know, I will be getting health insurance after this.
It's a weighted likelihood of being awake or asleep at a particular hour. So if you went to bed 2 hours later and woke up at the same time and typically sleep 9 hours per night, your sleep regularity just for those 2 days, because it would certainly be higher when factoring in more days in a week or a month where your sleep regularity is higher. But just comparing those 2 days, your sleep regularity would be like 78%, which I think was still in the top quintile. So that's actually totally fine. And you made a really great point earlier that you really only see a big ramp up in deleterious outcomes once it starts getting into that bottom quintile, kind of in the 40 range. So you have, I think this is called being hoisted on your own petard.
I take back everything I said earlier. I think we can draw causal relationships here. And ultimately, if I feel like I'm going to die as a result, that is what it is, you know? We will be suing.
Which brings us to the next point. But it really does, because, you know, for some of us, working later in the day is preferred, for me personally. And I think for you, Greg, to a certain extent. And this is time for yet another victory lap for late night boys, where we're going to look at chronotype and the associations between chronotype, morbidity, and mortality in our now podcast favorite UK Biobank cohort by Knudsen et al. 2018, where essentially they looked at, again, data from the UK Biobank cohort study, including over 500,000 individuals aged 37 to 73 years from the UK, with a mean follow-up time of over 6 years. Now, chronotype was determined using a single self-reported question from the UK Biobank questionnaire, which essentially categorized participants into definite morning types, moderate morning types, moderate evening types, or definite evening types. I would categorize myself as the latter. What about you, Greg? Same?
Yeah, I'm a definite evening type for sure.
And you, Milo?
By this, I would say wait, what's the opposite of definite?
Moderate.
Category? Moderate. That's like a moderate morning type, but I used to be a definite evening type. I used to think I had delayed sleep phase disorder, which is basically just, by the categorization here, being a definite evening type, but turning into disorder apparently.
All right. And this is... okay, I'll make my jokes after the informative content. So the primary outcomes here...
Have you had more time to workshop that acronym?
Which one? What?
Oh,
no.
Just,
I got it. Because the one thing I hate, I'll say it now, actually, since we opened the bracket, is I get sleep shamed quite a bit because of my wake time, without considering the sleep time. So it's like, oh, you woke up at 11 or 11 a.m. or 12 p.m. You're lazy. And it's like, bro, I went to bed at 6. Like, it's the same as if I had gone to bed at 10 and woken up at like 4 a.m. Like, I would be hailed as a David Goggins sort of motivator there. Anyways. So the authors focused on a few primary outcomes, including all-cause mortality, cardiovascular disease mortality, obtaining data from the NHS, the National Health Service here in the UK. They adjusted their analysis for covariates like age, sex, ethnicity, smoking status, BMI, socioeconomic status, sleep duration, and other comorbidities. at the end, they had about like 27% of the sample was definite morning types, 35% was moderate morning types, 28% were moderate evening types, and we're part of the few 9% were definite evening types. This is for you guys. So definite morning types tended to be older and included a higher proportion of women and non-smokers. And eveningness essentially was associated with a higher prevalence of comorbidities, including psychological disorders, diabetes, neurological disorders, and other disorders. Now, greater eveningness, I like the term, was linked to a small increased risk in all-cause mortality. So we're talking about a hazard ratio of 1.02 and a hazard ratio of 1.04 for cardiovascular disease mortality, with definite evening type showing a significantly increased risk of all-cause mortality compared with definite morning types. Now, the results, though, suggest that mortality risk in evening types may be rather due to behavioral, psychological, and physiological factors, possibly from chronic misalignment between physiological and social timing. And the authors obviously noted that there were a few limitations that needed to be addressed. One, the single question that was asked at the beginning, and that the UK Biobank cohort is generally healthier than the general UK population, which can potentially limit generalizability. Any comments?
Yeah, I think I think this is another like correlation causation thing. It's like, there's a question of why are you staying up so late, and what impact does that have on other stuff, and what are you doing to fill your time? You know what I mean? Like if you're out at the pubs drinking until 4 a.m. and you have to get up for a 9 to 5 the next morning, and so you're not sleeping much. You could say, oh, like I'm a definite evening type. I'm up late all the time, and like that's probably not going to be good for you overall. But if you are a definite evening type and you're a second shift worker and you get off work at midnight and go wind down for a couple hours, get in bed at 3, get up at 11, that's a normal schedule for you, and you have an otherwise like normal life and whatnot, like that's probably fine. Like that's kind of how I read this, where it's like, yeah, how does that eveningness look for you? Like what are you doing that late in the day? How does that impact other aspects of your life? And if you're being irresponsible and it's like dramatically affecting your sleep quality and all this other stuff, yeah, like it's probably not good. But if you live an otherwise pretty normal life and you're up late because you just naturally want to be up late and you keep like a pretty decent schedule otherwise, like, seems to be fine. Like not that big of a deal.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. There's a couple things that struck me. So one is definitely in alignment with what you mentioned. Back when I had chronic insomnia, one thing I lamented dearly was the fact that I just found myself waking up in the early afternoon when most people were kind of in the middle of their day, getting a lot of work done. And then just as I was kind of starting to wake up, most people would start winding down for the day. So essentially, I had to face a choice of, do I now work while people are winding down and socializing and miss out on socializing, or do I socialize and further delay being productive? And it kind of almost always felt like a pick your poison situation, and it was difficult. Just kind of going hand in hand with what you said, like how do you fill up your time if you are more of a definite evening type, whether it's via some sort of psychological disorder or whether it's by just overall physiology and disposition. And that's kind of reflected in the psychological outcomes and associations in the study. So while most physiological outcomes had a relatively modest increase in odds ratio when you went from definite morning type to definite evening type, like we're talking about increases in odds ratio from 1 to 1.07 or 1 to about 1.2 or 1.3 at the most. For psychological disorders, it was from 1 to 1.94. So a 94% relative increase. Again, relative increase, not absolute increase. So if your average chance of, say, having depression is 1% or 10%, what have you, you don't suddenly go up to 100%. You go up to 1.94%. So it is notable that I think psychological disorders specifically are a higher odds ratio, but I think that's specifically more prone to reverse causation, where I think people with psychological disorders like insomnia, although in this case they might have been excluded for this analysis, but generally I think that comorbidities of depression and insomnia are pretty common. And those things just tend to mess with your sleep. And in my experience, and from people I've spoken to at least, anecdotal now, make you more of a definite evening type. So, hey ho, that's kind of my takeaway here as well.
Yeah, 100%. That's one of the things that I don't necessarily struggle with, but have to. I think I've found ways to manage it. But psychologically, waking up at a time where people have maybe like 3 to 4 hours left of their workday, and there is sometimes this feeling of okay, we're behind schedule. When in reality, telling myself that we're going to be working late when people are asleep, and sort of calming myself down needs to be brought in. However, we didn't want to just look at the study by Natsun et al., but also a follow-up study. So a study actually that aimed to replicate the UK Biobank findings on chronotype and mortality with a longer follow-up using the Finnish twin cohort from 1981. The chronotype and mortality, a 37-year follow-up study in Finnish adults by Hublin et al. From 2023, where 23,000 participants who self-reported their chronotype from clearly a morning person to clearly an evening person were included, and they were followed up until the end of 2018, where over 8,000 deaths were analyzed. So the authors adjusted for education, alcohol consumption, smoking, BMI, and sleep duration. And they found a 9% increase in all-cause mortality for the evening type group with a hazard ratio of 1.09, which was mainly attenuated by smoking and alcohol consumption. So no increased mortality was observed among non-smokers and those who were at most light drinkers. And the authors also noted that there was no increase in cause-specific mortality, which then led them to conclude that chronotype has little to no independent contribution to mortality risk. So pretty much touches on what you guys were discussing now.
Yeah, I mean, just to summarize, I feel like Greg said it really well when he said it kind of depends on how you're spending your time.
Yeah.
If you're down at the pub at the Wetherspoons in the UK, smoking and drinking until 4 a.m. may not be ideal. If, on the other hand, you're on a podcast episode with your lovely co-hosts until midnight, hey, if that turns out to be a regular occurrence and shifts to chronotype, you may not actually be at West Health. So,
but also if you're in Wetherspoons or most pubs in the UK at 4 a.m., you are probably breaking in or have been forgotten inside that pub.
Indeed, you are a societal menace.
Wetherspoons closes at 12, and in general, things close pretty early here. So if you find yourself at 4 a.m. in some pub in the UK, maybe there's other things that you need to consider, and you may be facing some legal consequences for either forgetting to exit the pub or breaking into the pub. The SBS lawyer after this podcast, they're recommending hurricane walks. They're recommending breaking into pubs. What's happening?
Exercise doesn't help you.
Wait, y'all's. Do you have just like other pubs that are open later, or do they all just close at midnight?
Spoons doesn't close at midnight. Absolutely slanderous.
No, it does. And don't even, man. We came over there and we wanted to have what was it?
1 a.m., bro. Come on.
Yeah, depends on the location. In the US, we were like, oh, this is it. We can go and sit and eat at the restaurants at 10 p.m. That's Google Maps says it closes at 11:30, and it was takeaway only. And we were
most cities have at least one watering hole that's open real late.
I wanted White Castle.
That
was horrible. Though. That was a huge letdown.
Yeah, White Castle sucks.
Yeah, well, the movie, the classic movie, Harold and Kumar Go to White Castle, had hyped it up so much because the whole point of the movie is, they're looking for that specific burger. And possibly one of the biggest letdowns of my adult life without being hyperbolic whatsoever.
That being said, Chick-fil-A, goated.
Chick-fil-A rocks.
Agreed.
It's so good, dude. There's a 2-story Chick-fil-A within walking distance of where I live. It's so nice. I never go to the second story, but it's nice to know that people around here like chicken enough to warrant a second story. That's good, I think. But yeah, I thought like the kind of point of Harold and Kumar Go to White Castle is that like when you get high and get the munchies is the only time that a just disgusting White Castle burger is actually going to sound that good. Like I thought that was kind of. Oh,
it's
fair enough.
It was still not that good.
Yeah, I don't know. Like they don't sear it. Do you know how they cook White Castle burgers?
They steam them or some shit, right? Like it was wild to me.
So they take dehydrated onion, like, you know, just imagine you had onion powder, but it's cut into, 1-2 millimeter little cubes instead of ground all the way up. So they start with that. They put that down on a grill. They put water over it to rehydrate it. And then their burgers have like little holes poked in them for the steam to get through. And they just sit the burger patties on top of the onions to steam as the onions rehydrate. And then they put it on the bun.
Why would you ever steam a burger and miss out on that Maillard reaction,
I mean, the original burger was actually a steamed burger. I forget the name of the place, but it was like a restaurant in Connecticut that cooked their burgers in steam drawers. And that's kind of like where it started. But then like almost immediately, people realized, oh, wait, literally every other way to cook a burger is better than this. Yeah, you gotta get some Maillard browning on it. It's I don't know what they're doing there. I gotta say.
Let's steam a burger. Yeah, that was an absolute letdown, man. I was because I was legit hyped.
Hello, audience. At the top of this episode, I said in the second part of this episode, we'll talk about this and that. What I actually meant to say is in part 2 of this 2-part series, we're going to talk about those things. Because I know how much is left on the outline, and this is going to be a 2-parter. So let's so just to talk about kind of the last kind of like big overarching like health related thing that may be impacted by sleep duration and sleep quality. We think it's also worthwhile to talk about like weight regulation a little bit. Pac, I know you looked through some of these studies. I was the one that suggested this for the outline. Sure. Would you rather take the lead on this section, or would you like me to?
No, I'm more than happy to lead because I've also hidden an Easter egg. I don't know if whoever finds it first gets Greg instantly. Very close. I'm not gonna. All right, I'll speak, and whenever you find it. So the one thing that Greg highlighted that we didn't have in the outline is the impact of sleep on weight management, because that's something that we often see. We often see numbers out there. We often see people saying, "Hey, if you sleep X amount of time, you will burn mostly muscle or whatever X% less fat or whatever." So let's have a brief look at some of the literature out there. So the first study out there. The first study we're going to look at is titled Sleep Duration and Obesity Among Adults, a meta-analysis of prospective studies by Wu et al., 2014. So the authors of that study included studies on adults that examined the relationship between sleep duration and obesity, involving roughly close to 200,000 participants for short duration for short sleep duration analysis, and over 160,000 participants for long sleep duration analysis. Overall, they found that short sleep duration was significantly associated with an increased risk of future obesity, while long sleep duration did not really reveal a significant association. When the authors performed subgroup analyses, they found that they found consistent findings across genders and regions, with heterogeneity observed in the short sleep duration analysis. And when they then performed a sensitivity analysis, they identified 3 studies that contributed to that heterogeneity. And when excluding them, then that led to a more homogeneous but still significant association for sleep duration.
For sleep duration impacting risk of obesity, right?
Yes.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, I think this one is relatively clear. I think it's interesting to me that they adopted analysis where they essentially just categorize things into short and long sleep durations. But yeah, I mean, the sample was quite large, which generally to me suggests that there is probably something here that is worthy of note. And as we'll break down in some other studies, there's also some more, I hesitate to call it mechanistic, but some more like behavioral impacts of sleep that would then long-term potentially cause a greater risk of obesity. So there's kind of a clear chain of events of, where sleep impacts your behaviors and behaviors can impact your risk of obesity. It seems relatively clear-cut in that regard.
I will note that they did trichotomize sleep. That was that was like risks. That was like odds ratios in relation to normal sleep duration. So I think normal sleep duration was like 6 to 8 hours, and then less than 6, greater than 8. And so sleeping greater than 8 hours wasn't associated with increased risks of subsequently developing obesity compared to sleeping 6 to 8 hours, but sleeping less than 6 hours was associated with an increase in risk.
Anecdotally, that checks out to me a lot. When I did have insomnia and just generally spent less time sleeping, we're not going to break down any studies on hunger, I don't think, but I just found that having more time in the day and not sleeping as much, A, just opened up more opportunities for me to consume food and eat more and potentially gain weight, and B, just made me hungrier in general. Like I was awake for longer, or it messed with certain hormones, or I have no idea, but I did find that for sleep, it made me hungry.
Yeah, we are going to touch on that a little bit. Just to kind of skip ahead a little bit, just to give a too early summary of the stuff we're going to talk about. There are pretty consistent relationships between not sleeping much and gaining weight. You see that across multiple different types of studies. So the one that we just talked about, it was a meta-analysis of prospective cohort studies. I don't think we actually need to go through all of these studies like one by one, because they'll all be linked in the show notes. But there are ones taking kind of like different study designs. So they've also analyzed stuff in the context of like intervention studies where they have people on a weight management program where there is actually an intervention being administered. And even within that kind of like more controlled context, there's research looking at, hey, what are people's like rates of success in this program if they sleep more versus sleep less? And they tend to find either less weight loss, or if it's looking at maintenance of weight loss after a weight loss intervention, they see greater weight regain, or if it, like the previous example, just kind of like observational prospective cohort studies, they do tend to see greater weight gain over time. Either way, like across all aspects of resolution, across different like types of studies, you tend to see weight gain or less weight loss or poorer weight loss maintenance when people don't sleep quite as much. And the biggest reason for that, like you touched on, Milo, does largely seem to be related to appetite and energy intake. Again, like very consistently across multiple different lines of evidence, whether that be observational or in some cases they have also done kind of just like shorter term intervention studies. Again, you can't randomize people to sleep 4 hours per night for 12 weeks to observe something, but people sign up to sleep 4 hours per night for like 3 or 4 days in a row. And in those contexts as well, in kind of like more tightly controlled intervention studies, when people don't sleep much, ratings of satiety go down, ratings of appetite go up, and observed energy intake goes up as well. So, I don't think we need to dig into all of these studies, but we do tend to observe greater weight gain with poor sleep duration, and that does seem to be primarily mediated, I think, by two things. One is just effects on appetite. You have worse appetite regulation when you're not sleeping much, not sleeping well. And also your willpower tends to be a little bit lower. Like a lot of energy dense foods are hedonically pleasing, and it might take a little bit of willpower to resist them. But when you're sleepy and your willpower is lower, you might reach for some meals or snacks that otherwise you would choose healthier options over. That's what we tend to see just in this body of literature writ large.
And to deep dive in each individual study, no, I'm joking.
On that note, though, I do think it may be worth touching on the study by Tassali and colleagues on sleep extension, just because that is an intervention that people could feasibly use to facilitate weight loss or mitigate weight gain. But I agree that, broadly speaking, hey, if you don't sleep as much or your sleep is poor, it's going to impact your fat loss, weight loss journey negatively in a variety of ways. And that relationship seems consistent in a variety of research scenarios. So, for sure. Yeah.
Anecdotally, though, to echo you, Milo, whenever I don't sleep enough, so the few days, when we have to travel and I have to sleep, 4 to 5 hours, the hunger and appetite for foods that I wouldn't normally eat is always through the roof. And I'm never hungry when I wake up, except those times. I usually can push my eating window by at least 4 hours.
Yeah, ditto. As a fun anecdote, when I used to have insomnia, I would often, go to bed, try to fall asleep. After a couple hours, realize, this really ain't working. And then my brain would go, what's a good idea right now? Go ahead and have breakfast for tomorrow. Have it now, just get it over with. Which, and this is not my expertise, but which in terms of chronotype may not be the best idea to have meals when you want to be sleeping necessarily. So, hey ho, weird stuff happens when your sleep is disrupted.
Yeah, no, I'm the exact same way. When I'm not when I'm sleeping well, I tend to find it easier to make good food choices, stick to a diet, etc. If I get like a little sleep deprived, it's still fine. Once I get past like a certain point, though, I get very, very snacky for sure.
But unfortunately, the two of us are not as blessed as Dr. Wolf here, who during his cutting phases eats 4,000 calories a day. And for me, it's like, had that extra croissant. Okay, there you go. 1 kilo in water weight. So,
damn.
not to metabolism shame you, Milo.
It's too late now. I'm going to sleep shame you for the rest of all time now.
Yeah. So just to quickly touch on Tassali et al. 2022, they essentially looked at the effect of sleep extension on objectively assessed energy intake among adults with overweight in real life settings. So they essentially, the whole study was 4 weeks long, and participants were adults aged 21 to 40 years old with a BMI between 25 and 29 that slept less than 6.5 hours per sleep. They excluded individuals with shift work, sleep disorders, and those with medication that could affect sleep or their metabolism. And they were randomized to either a 2-week sleep extension group or a control group that continued their usual sleep with blinding to minimize bias. Now, the total duration of the study, as I said, was 4 weeks, with 2 weeks being used as the habitual sleep period time at baseline. Now, they monitor sleep and wake patterns using wrist actigraphy, and energy intake and expenditure were assessed through the doubly labeled water method and indirect calorimetry. Now, the sleep extension group experienced a significant increase in sleep duration compared to the control group, which resulted in a notable reduction in energy intake, roughly by 270 calories per day. And in those few weeks, a modest weight loss for like roughly half a kilo or like about a pound from baseline. Those significant changes were observed in total energy expenditure, which I think is interesting. And yeah, obviously some limitations to be noted is that the study was just 4 weeks long, and the participants were from a specific demographic that may limit generalizability.
Yeah, so one thing about the study that's very positive to me and just gives me sort of hope for sleep extension to benefit weight loss in, at the very least, in people who aren't sleeping very much. And in this case, less than 6.5 hours is relatively little for a demographic aged between 21 to 40 years old. So at least in people who are not sleeping much, sleep extension can meaningfully impact energy intake. Now, assuming there is no concomitant decrease in energy expenditure, like for example, you might see that eventually energy expenditure could decrease by reductions in fidgeting, or just broadly speaking, non-exercise activity thermogenesis, or NEAT. But assuming there is no such compensation, a reduction in energy intake of about 270 calories could result in an additional weight loss of like half a pound a week or so. And, assuming nothing else happens, which usually with physiology it does when you lose weight and stuff, half a pound a week is relatively substantial. If you went from just eating at maintenance while being sleep deprived to not really intentionally eating less, but just kind of eating ad libitum but sleeping more, that could be half a pound of weight loss a week. And over just 6 months, that could be 12 pounds of weight loss, which is pretty substantial, at least when sleep extension is sustained. Obviously, caveats apply. This was a 4-week study. Whether or not that generalizes out onto longer time frames and what have you, I don't think it wouldn't necessarily. Like, I can see a mechanism by which it shouldn't generalize or pan out over longer time frames, going from being sleeping less to sleeping more. But at the very least, I think the difference is meaningfully or practically relevant. Whereas for some outcomes, sometimes you see the results and you're like, I'm not sure this makes much of a difference. 270 calories per day, that's a sizable, appreciable difference in my view.
Yeah. And that is kind of the magnitude of impact you tend to see in stuff. And like you said, a limitation is a lot of these studies do tend to be shorter term. But yeah, what you do tend to see, because I've looked at a lot of research on this topic, and kind of ad libitum energy intake with sleep restriction tends to increase by somewhere between 1 and 400 calories, give or take. I find it pretty plausible that you would see a similar effect in the opposite direction with sleep extension, on the proviso that people were maybe undersleeping a little bit before. Like I suspect that there would be a limit to that. Like, I bet if you're sleeping 9 hours a night and you slept 10 instead, I would not be surprised if that didn't affect your ad libitum energy intake at all. But like, a lot of people do probably undersleep a little bit. And so if that's going from like 6 hours to 7 hours, yeah, like I can see it like very plausibly kind of ameliorating the increase in energy intake that you may experience if you don't sleep enough.
Yeah. And again, they included people with like 6.5 that reported 6.5 hours of sleep per night. I doubt that that's 6.5 hours of bang on time spent sleeping versus time in bed, which for me personally, like last night, it took me about 50 minutes to fall asleep. So my time in bed was like 8 hours. Time asleep was roughly, 6.5 hours. So, these could have been individuals that slept more like 5 to 6 hours per per day versus 6.5.
Yeah.
Cool.
The other thing that I did want to pull out that you had alluded to initially, kind of like teeing up this segment, Pack, was impact of sleep duration on composition of weight loss, because that is something that gets talked about a fair bit, and this is a topic where there are a handful of actual intervention studies. Now, they don't tend to be particularly long, but they do exist. So yeah, like you probably wouldn't want to extrapolate them out forever, but we're talking about a study with like a 2-week intervention period and a study with an 8-week intervention period that I'm going to talk about here a little bit. The first one is a classic that I wrote about for Stronger by Science way back in the day, maybe like 2014, called "Insufficient Sleep Undermines Dietary Efforts to Reduce Adiposity." This is a classic experiment in this space. It was a 2-week crossover study, so all of the subjects went through both conditions in a randomized order, and basically for 2 weeks straight, they spent either 8.5 hours in bed or 5.5 hours in bed. They were put on a pretty low calorie diet. Like I think it was like down to, I think it was like a reduction in energy intake of like 40% from baseline. So like relatively large deficit, which makes sense. Like you would need a pretty large deficit to induce measurable changes in body composition in each of these like 2-week intervention phases. But what they found is that when subjects were sleeping 5.5 hours per night versus 8.5 hours per night, they lost the same amount of weight on the scale in total. But with the 5.5 hours of sleep, they only lost 0.6 kilos of fat versus 2.4 kilos of lean mass, which is not great. That's generally not what you want to see. Losing 80% of your weight as lean mass, which, a fair bit of that was probably water. That's not like all muscle mass or anything, but those aren't great ratios, versus roughly 50-50 when they were sleeping 8.5 hours per night, losing 1.4 kilos of fat and 1.5 kilos of lean mass. So again, you didn't see like great, tremendously awesome ratios of fat mass to lean mass loss with 8.5 or 5.5 hours, but you're looking at like a 50-50 split of lean mass versus fat mass lost with 8 hours of sleep versus closer to 80-20 with 5.5 hours of sleep, which that's a pretty notable difference, I think. And then in 2018, there was a similar study by Wang and colleagues that I think was just a notable improvement on the 2011 study that I had just mentioned, in that it was a longer duration and it also used a more ecologically valid intervention, I would say. So it was an 8-week study, and subjects were randomized to a calorie restriction or a calorie restriction with sleep restriction group. Both groups maintained the same general level of energy intake. So it was around like resting metabolic rate. That's like how much they were assigned to eat. So again, like pretty big deficit, but not absolutely crazy. And one group basically ate a low calorie diet and just slept like normal. And then the other group, they reduced time in bed 5 nights a week and were allowed to sleep as much as they wanted the other 2 nights a week. So basically kind of like sleeping less during the week and sleeping a little bit more on weekends. And the like magnitude of change in sleep duration was like pretty reasonable. So the calorie restriction plus sleep restriction group ended up sleeping about an hour less per night during the week than normal, and about an hour longer than normal per night on the weekends. So, it's kind of like if you usually sleep 7 hours a night every night, it would be sort of like sleeping 6 hours a night Monday through Friday and 8 hours a night Saturday and Sunday. So, we're not talking about a 3-hour difference in sleep duration between conditions. We're talking about the sorts of like differences in sleep duration that people do actually experience in the real world. So I would say that this was a more ecologically valid intervention. But the results were broadly similar to the other study that I mentioned. So the group that just did calorie restriction ended up on average. Well, okay, so the results are a little bit weird numerically. I was debating whether I wanted to talk about this, but I will, whatever. So if you look at group means, the results were very similar. So I'm just going to start referring to them as normal sleep and short sleep group. The normal sleep group lost 1.9 kilos of fat. The short sleep group lost 1.8 kilos of fat. The normal sleep group lost 0.71 kilos of lean mass. The short sleep group lost 0.72 kilos of lean mass. So those group means look very similar. Mm-hmm. But then there was a separate analysis that was percentage of total mass lost as fat mass and lean mass. And these would be the individual percent changes averaged versus the percent changes implied by the group mean changes, if that makes sense. Like, do you follow me there? Okay. So they found, and for the listener, like I'll explain that a little bit more in a second. So the normal sleep group, the individuals in that group, on average, 80% of the mass they lost was fat mass, and like 18% was lean mass. And in the short sleep group, like 17% of the mass they lost was fat mass versus like 85% for lean mass. So you're looking at basically inverted ratios where the group that was sleeping a normal amount, it was like 80-20 fat mass loss versus lean mass. And with the short sleep group, it was like 20-80, where they're losing 4 times as much lean mass as fat mass on average. So that does imply a very interesting statistical distribution there, where like the group mean changes were similar, but the average percentage changes for the individuals differed quite a bit. What that implies is that a handful of people in the normal sleep group, it means that for most individuals in the normal sleep group, they lost way more fat mass than lean mass. And most of the individuals in the short sleep group lost way more lean mass than fat mass. But a small handful of people in the normal sleep group had very deleterious body composition outcomes. And just a small handful of them lost a shitload of lean mass and very little fat. And the inverse would be true for the short sleep group. So a handful of them lost a ton of fat and had very favorable lean mass outcomes. Like that is how you would wind up with that discord between the group means and the individual percentage changes. So in effect, the way I would interpret this study is the typical response to sleeping less while losing weight is losing more lean mass. But there is quite a bit of inter-individual variability. Like that's what kind of the discord between the percentage changes and the group means implies there. But yeah, this does, I think, soften the findings from that 2011 study, insufficient sleep undermines dietary efforts to reduce adiposity. Like the group mean findings weren't quite as large and as different as in the previous study, but I think the overall takeaway is pretty similar, where like dieting and not sleeping much will probably result in greater lean mass loss, even if it doesn't end up compromising total weight loss. And I will also note that if someone did want to contend that this would generalize to like building muscle, this is probably the strongest line of research to lean on. Just the body composition changes in weight loss interventions. Like, it's not that far of a stretch to say, hey, if we're seeing greater lean mass loss when dieting, when you're not sleeping much, yeah, maybe you'll see less muscle growth when at maintenance or bulking if you're not sleeping much. I do think that's a perfectly reasonable assumption to make, but like I mentioned at the top of the episode, we don't have a ton of research. Well, we don't have any research on that directly. But yeah.
I think that's pretty reasonable. Listening to you speak about these two studies and reading up on them a little bit in real time, one kind of question to you I would have is, to what extent do you think these differences, and obviously this is going to be highly speculative, whatever answer you do give, but to what extent do you think the differences observed in relative losses in fat versus lean mass observed would still be present had these studies involved a relatively higher protein intake? Not to say that protein intake plays a huge role in the absence of lifting, but it plays an appreciable role. So I just ran some numbers. In the first study by, this is a bit of a name, Nedelcheva and colleagues, the 2011 study. In that study, participants were having about 65 grams of protein a day on average. So their optimal protein intake, according to the Morton meta-analysis on protein intake, would be around 130. So they were having around half of their optimal protein intake. And likewise, in the 2017 study by Wang and colleagues, they were having around 84 grams of protein per day, whereas their optimal protein intake, assuming 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight is optimal, would be around 150. So again, like roughly half of their optimal protein intake. So one, their protein intake was relatively far below what would be considered optimal in the context of resistance training. And two, as I just mentioned, that would be in the context of resistance training. In these interventions, there was no resistance training. Do you think that difference or that effect of insufficient sleep would still be as large in the context of also performing resistance training and having adequate protein? Do you think there would still be an effect? Obviously, highly speculative, but go.
Well, you're skipping ahead a little bit to the second episode in this 2-part sleep series. But yeah, for protein intake, I suspect that it would have similar impacts on both groups, in that both groups would lose a little more fat mass and a little less lean mass, but I would not expect it to affect the relative difference between groups all that much. Could be wrong about that, but that's just kind of my gut feeling on that. Exercise, though, I do, and this is why I said, like, this is the strongest thing you could lean on if you wanted to try to make claims about impacts on muscle growth. But it is still like pretty indirect, because I do think the impact of exercise is pretty enormous. And spoiler alert for episode 2 here. A lot of the stuff we're talking about, exercise does help ameliorate a lot of it. Like, not completely get rid of all of the effects, but like significantly dampen them. But yeah, so one of the things you see with exercise, and I didn't pull these studies and put them in the outline. I'll try to remember to put them in the show notes, not making any promises. But yeah, one of the things you see with exercise, or with short sleep, is that it reduces baseline muscle protein synthesis. Like, if you just bring someone into the lab in the morning or like in the early afternoon, after they sleep 8 hours the night before versus 5 hours the night before, just their baseline muscle protein synthesis levels are lower after short sleep duration. But then after exercise, like post-exercise muscle protein synthesis rates are the same after sleep restriction versus normal sleep. And And so, if muscle protein synthesis is elevated for 24 to 48 hours after a workout, and post-exercise muscle protein synthesis seems to be fairly similar regardless of sleep, I would need to look back at some of those studies to see how long they were measured for. It could have just been like 4 hours. It could have been like longer duration, like using a deuterium dilution. I don't remember those details right off the top of my head, but my overall takeaway is that I do think exercise would significantly bring the groups closer together. I wouldn't be surprised if the short sleep groups did still end up losing a little more lean mass, but I would expect the difference to be way, way, way smaller if you had inadequate exercise intervention, just because I suspect the effects on the body composition changes are largely downstream of those changes in baseline muscle protein synthesis. But if you're ameliorating that effect via an exercise stimulus, I think you would wind up with much, much more similar longitudinal body composition outcomes.
I think that's a solid take, and I agree with that by and large, but I just wanted to get your thoughts ahead of part 2.
Which I will note, this is like a little bit far afield and like kind of indirect evidence, but I think it's relevant. One of the things, so I do follow the sleep research pretty closely. As someone who at various times in my life has either been a bad sleeper or at other times in my life is just someone who sometimes keeps a very degenerate sleep schedule. I follow this stuff closely. I want to know how much trouble I'm in. And one of the things that you see in the research on athletes is sleep specialists are, and I'm sure we'll talk about this a little bit in the next episode as well, but sleep specialists are just all about the how little athletes sleep. That's something that comes up all the time, where they're like, we have an epidemic in athletes. None of them are sleeping enough, or a lot of them aren't sleeping enough, and we're sure that that's negatively impacting performance and recovery and blah blah blah, whatever. And I'm sure it is. I'm not contesting that at all. But also, I don't know, just in terms of actual body composition and performance outcomes, a lot of the research finding that athletes aren't sleeping enough are done on high level athletes, collegiate athletes, Olympians, professional athletes who, maybe sleeping longer would help them perform better and would help them have better body composition, but they have great body composition and they perform really, really well. So whatever the deleterious impact of sleep is on those outcomes, it's not enough to keep people from becoming professional athletes, I guess. So, and a notable thing about professional athletes is they exercise a lot, And so I use that as just kind of a reality check on a lot of this stuff. Were it true that not sleeping enough necessarily causally directly led to really horrible hypertrophy outcomes, really horrible body composition outcomes, of the type of magnitude that I think a lot of people kind of scaremonger about, or even if you're just trying to directly translate some of these intervention studies I talked about to an athletic context, were all of that true, and did all of that generalize the way that I think people present it as if it does? It shouldn't be possible for as many high-level athletes to sleep as little as they do. But so yeah, I do think that should temper some of the fears that people might have, and I do think is also fairly suggestive that exercise really is a get out of jail free card for a lot of things. And sleeping a lot and exercising a lot, I think, is better than not sleeping much and exercising a lot. But exercise is good stuff. I think that it probably does mitigate a lot of the negative body composition ramifications of short sleep.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think exercise of the interventions that we can run, whether it's like, increasing protein intake, taking X or Y supplement, maybe short of taking steroids, is the most meaningful effect that you'll see. Minus, obviously, the impact of, for example, genetics on overall adaptations and performance and what have you. And I think the general shit test of, all right, let's assume that this thing we're talking about is playing a super large role. Is it preventing people with a variety of practices from getting very successful and very jacked? Because if so, you would expect to see that in the real world. And I use this for example, range of motion and stuff as well, where, all right, let's assume that partial range of motion reps at short muscle lengths are worse for hypertrophy. Can they really be that much worse if basically almost everyone in the gym does them, and everyone at a high level also does them, and has gotten extremely jacked without ever training in the fully lengthened position? The same can be said for rep ranges, like a variety of interventions, right? So it's an interesting shit test. It's different from saying, all right, what are the jacked dudes doing? It's different from that in the sense that oftentimes you're looking at a more representative sample and seeing whether or not this is likely to play a big effect. But I just like that shit test as a, is it going to get you to detect small differences between, let's say, a set of 3 and a set of 8 in the research? No. But is it going to be able to tell you, does this play a really large role that we can feasibly observe in the gym or in your sport? Yes. And I think that's a really useful little practical tool. So highly agreed.
Yeah, I think when developing heuristics, I think the thing people want to do is look at what successful people do and assume that everything they did directly contributed to their success, which you can't draw that type of inference. But I do think that if you see enough people who are successful in a particular domain doing something that maybe like the research suggests is suboptimal or whatever, I think an inference you can draw is that the negative effect that has on the outcome of interest is small enough that it didn't preclude them from reaching a high level. You know what I mean? Like it suggests that of the practices that they employ, a lot of them are probably good, a lot of them are probably neutral, and the ones that are negative can't be that negative,
It brings us back to the age-old question, controversial question of, would Ronnie have had bigger legs had he squatted deeper?
He squatted pretty deep.
He did actually, yeah. But he could have squatted deeper.
Man, yeah. Let's talk about Ronnie Coleman's squat. He didn't. His depth was like questionable for a power lifter, but that's because he had like really intense forward knee travel.
Yeah.
Like the level of knee flexion he achieved was probably greater than the level of knee flexion achieved by powerlifters squatting to parallel. It's just the biomechanical approach he took led to those knee flexion angles at a like smaller hip flexion or a larger hip flexion angle.
Yeah, I tend to agree.
Larger hip angle, less hip flexion. You know what I'm saying.
I also just feel like with how jacked Ronnie got eventually, like judging depth on someone who weighs 150 pounds is probably quite different from judging depth on someone who weighs 300 pounds with very jacked legs, and from a front angle.
Well, and at some point the hamstrings get in the way of the quads. Like muscle tissue is finitely compressible. That is a true thing about it. Yeah.
The burden of success, too jacked to get deeper and get more jacked.
I think we are wrapping things up with sleep stuff for part 1 here.
Shall we give the crowd a small, not a taste, but a teaser? Because you mentioned exercise mitigating some of the negative effects of poor sleep on muscle mass, etc. Stay tuned for a part 2 where you find out that, hey, it may also do the same for your health.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. That is one of the things we're going to discuss. Going back to Ronnie and how jacked he was, though, and range of motion. The reason I was asking if we were done with the content is whatever. This is relevant to exercise. I figure we can keep riffing a little bit, but
Let's do it.
There are people that get mad when we get off track. And so I wanted to let them know that they could tune out now if they really were just here for the sleep stuff. But dude, one of the things that you see when you look at the research on exercise and range of, or resistance training and range of motion is a lot of the acute, or not acute, but a lot of the longitudinal studies on untrained individuals suggest that resistance training increases range of motion and flexibility. There was a meta-analysis maybe 2 years ago comparing it to stretching, finding that resistance training seemed to be just as effective at improving range of motion as stretching was. But then there's also research looking at range of motion in really muscular people. So I think Spence and colleagues did a couple studies on powerlifters a few years back and found that they had limited range of motion in certain joints. And I was looking through the joints and the ranges of motion where powerlifters did have substandard ranges of motion, and the tests used to assess range of motion at those joints and joint actions. And in almost all cases, it was just certain things where just being jacked would reduce your range of motion because your muscle would get in the way. One of them was shoulder horizontal abduction, and it was an active test. So you actively had to try to pull your hands as far behind your back as possible, and that was limited in male powerlifters. And it's just that is supposed to be testing kind of the extensibility of your pec muscles. When I do that, I don't feel a stretch in my chest. My traps and rhomboids just can't compress anymore. And rear delts as I try to actively move my arms further and further back. So I don't know. I do think it is slept on that certain joint ranges of motion, if you get big enough, they will get worse. If you have really big biceps, you're going to have limited elbow flexion. Why? Because your big ass biceps are in the way. And yeah, that's a disconnect, I think, between the intervention flexibility research and stuff actually looking at flexibility in very jacked people.
2 thoughts. 1, a victim of your own success. And 2, I think that it might have to do with, I'm not sure what your take is on this, but the fact that they were powerlifters specifically. Maybe the range of motion in training wasn't sufficient to induce those range of motion adaptations, combined with your idea of they were just too jacked to even be that flexible. But certainly, anecdotally, having trained as not a powerlifter for 10 years, I do think my flexibility overall has gotten better and better as I kept training. But hey, could it be because I'm not yet jacked enough? I'll keep pursuing it.
No, I mean, I think my flexibility is definitely better than it used to be, but it's just some things your muscle just gets in the way. I think one of the other things that was limited was knee flexion, and it was an active knee flexion test. And it's you tense your hamstring to flex your knee. If you have bigger hamstrings, if you don't have some sort of joint limitation, your knee flexion is just directly mechanistically limited by how big are your hamstrings and how big are your calves. That's another clear example. Powerlifters, even if they're only squatting to parallel, that's not going to cause structural changes in the knee that stop it from achieving full knee flexion.
Yeah, that's true. My thinking there was specifically distal hypertrophy, or hypertrophy of the hamstrings closer to the knee, would cause the biggest issue. And so, hey, the same training at lengthened positions that could make you more flexible could also be limiting your range of motion by having your hamstring just get too jacked at that point,
That is true, but you do have to get quite jacked for that. Yeah, never mind. We're not going to turn this into a deep dive on stretching.
It's another length and partial episode, baby.
Do you guys have any other just sleep related thoughts or things you want to share before we wrap up?
I have one more, actually. So in many of these studies, they assess sleep duration via self-reported sleep, but in some, they did use both actigraphy and polysomnography as a means to assess different sleep phases or sleep duration or what have you. And I actually have experience with both of those, including also the near infrared spectrometer for the purpose of assessing obstructive sleep apnea. So I've had experience with all of these, and hopefully I can in the next episode provide some feedback on that.
You went dark on us, by the way.
Yeah, I saw. I think we're back. I think my webcam assumed that it had been too long for this to reasonably still be in use. So
we broke Riverside. We broke your camera. The one thing I wanted to slightly mention is that the insufficient sleep undermines dietary efforts to reduce adiposity was relatively recently shared with a caption that sleeping 5 instead of 7.5 hours reduces fat loss and increases muscle loss by over 50%. And that caused a bit of a discussion around it. So it was nice that you touched on it. Absolute classic of a study.
Mm-hmm.
Where was that shared?
It was shared by Meno on his Instagram.
I feel like that just highlights the difficulty in communicating relative changes without people losing sleep over it. Pun intended.
Hey. Also, what I wanted to ask Greg, but if I ask on air, it will take us another couple of hours to finish. And I think you've touched on it previously on other sleep episodes. And it had to do with fear mongering and sleep and the book Why We Sleep.
Yes, I remember that rabbit hole.
For that one, I think I forget what episode it was, but I would just refer people to the prior episode we did talking about that a little bit. And yeah, we can put the link to the Goozy article in the show notes if people want to dig into that a little bit more. Yeah, I think one of the reasons that sleep is so hot right now, to paraphrase Zoolander, is the Matthew Walker book Why We Sleep was a runaway smash hit, and I think continues to be quite popular. And it is, I think, fairly alarmist. My wife read it. I have skimmed it. And I've listened to lectures from Matthew Walker. I probably shouldn't admit this on air, but I'm going to, whatever. Dude, I think a lot of like nonfiction books are just a scam. Like in almost all cases, this is just my feeling. I think a lot of them have 15,000 words of content, and they're like, yeah, but that's a blog post, and no one's going to buy a 30-page book, but we can sell it if you can really pad that shit out. And so, yeah, like in skimming his book, I came across almost nothing of import that he hasn't discussed in like lectures. So whatever. I will admit I haven't read the book, but I think I get the vibe, and I had the vibe further reported to me by my wife who read it. But it does seem like quite alarmist about a lot of this stuff, and a lot of the alarmism appears to be based on it seems to be fairly motivated and not necessarily perfectly representative interpretations of the literature on this. And there was a blog post critiquing and breaking down a lot of the scientific distortions that was published in 2019, like pretty soon after the book, and has been updated a few times since, that we've previously talked about in another episode. And if Yeah, if you read Why We Sleep and you're really freaked out, and when you sleep less than 8 hours, you think you're instantly going to get cancer and die, and the wheels are just going to fall off, I would strongly recommend reading the, honestly, pretty simultaneously extremely fair and extremely brutal deconstruction of a lot of the stuff in the Why We Sleep book. The brutality is owing to the fairness.
Yes.
It doesn't come across as personal. It comes across as a guy who's just curious. Hey, I started digging into this, and I was shocked to find he misrepresented everything, which is way more devastating than if it just came across as someone with a big axe to grind. Anyway, that'll be in the show notes for anyone who read Why We Sleep and that ironically negatively impacted their sleep, because you're freaked out every time you lay down in bed because you think if you don't fall asleep immediately and get 8 hours of high quality sleep, you're instantly going to die. If that describes you, there is an antidote to that in the show notes.
Yes. And to summarize what we talked about, just because it's something people somewhat asked for, sleep duration, anywhere between 7 to 8 hours seems to be a solid sweet spot. However, sleep regularity, and I think in the study that we looked at, having an hour window that is consistent as far as sleep-wake times go, also solid when trying to optimize sleep for health-related outcomes. But overall, things are not as grim as some people make them out to be. Unless you're sleeping 2 hours a day and, rolling a pair of dice to choose when you're going to sleep every day, you are probably going to be fine. Do your best to sleep 6 to 8 hours, to be asleep 6 to 8 hours per night. Try to be as consistent as you can. And yeah, we're episode 2 for how you can mitigate if you cannot achieve those things. Stronger by Science podcast, baby.
Absolutely. So thanks, everyone, for tuning in to another episode of the Stronger by Science podcast. We love you. We appreciate you all. And we'll talk to you again more about sleep in a couple weeks.
Peace.
Peace.